Well, it's amazing what can change in a year. If 2019 was the year of the finale, where every major ongoing story reached its conclusion, 2020 was a year of uncertainty. With the ongoing crisis, there hasn't been any safe beans for collective blockbuster storytelling. In comes The Mandalorian Season 2. Bearing the weight of Disney+, it has now set the stage for what looks like the future of media. In 2019, The Mandalorian was the side event. It was the setup for Rise of Skywalker's grand finale. As fate would have it, The Mandalorian would become the beacon for Star Wars, while Rise became a fart in the wind. Part of why Mandalorian Season 1 thrived was that it was just a side quest. Lucasfilm was perfectly fine with it being its own thing, telling an isolated yet satisfying story. In the process, they created a rock-solid foundation for a set of characters that can last them a generation. Season 2 tests this foundation by throwing the entire franchise's future at its doorstep. A year ago, I made a video outlining just how well this show started off. In particular, the 3-episode arc that begins this show does a phenomenal job developing its characters and giving the audience a reason to root for them going forward. I can't emphasize enough how important these 3 episodes are. They are the rock-solid core that got this thing started, and also the goodwill that will get us through any of the rough patches. Seriously, beginnings are so important. The Walking Dead wouldn't have made it to Season 3 if it didn't have one of the best pilots in television history. After this arc, The Mandalorian became an episodic adventure into exploring the many corners of this galaxy. In any given episode, we would meet a new community, explore new and familiar types of characters, all the while developing and testing the growing relationship between Din Djarin and the child. Part of what I loved about these episodes was how they often subverted the common tropes present in Star Wars. Our 2 protagonists, after all, are derivative reimaginings of fan-favorite characters. If I could give a tagline to these episodes, it would be, taking the familiar and making them unfamiliar. One of my favorite examples is the arc given to Mando's fellow bounty hunter, IG-11. Like Mando, IG-11 is an alteration of another fan-favorite character from Empire, IG-88, a cool-looking robot in the background of one scene. In the first episode of the show, IG-11 gets a grand entrance where we get to see him kick some ass. While he showcases tremendous skill, the fun of this scene is how the show pokes fun at this obtuse machine, using him to highlight Mando's disdain for robots, a key character trait for this season.
Droids.
The function of this character, ultimately, is to contrast with the Mandalorian and bring out his humanity. One is a cold robot on a mission, and the other is the protector of a helpless child. Thus, Mando kills him, reinforcing his distrust of robots and forging the bond with the internet's most beloved meme. IG-11 had served his purpose, and yet, there was still more to his story. As is the key for this entire show, IG-11 goes through a transformation. After being reprogrammed by Mando's ally Kuiil, IG-11 is turned into a nurse droid and given the primary function of protecting the child. All of Mando's tensions regarding droids comes to a head with this new dynamic. He doesn't trust him in the slightest, and expects betrayal at every turn. It's a surprise then that IG-11 sticks to his new programming and comes to save the child and Mando in their most desperate hour. When injured and on death's door, Mando makes the choice to take off his helmet, the ultimate sign of his vulnerability and humanity, and allows this former foe to save him. This is Deus Ex Machina done right. It saves the heroes from danger, but it does so at the cost of learning and growth. This show, after all, is all about getting Din Djarin to take off his damn helmet. The season begins with IG-11 being mercilessly destroyed, and it ends with him going out like a hero. The gag from the first episode becomes the child's salvation, and even Din can't help but feel sad.
I'm not sad.
Yes, you are. I'm a nurse droid. I've analyzed your voice.
This is why The Mandalorian felt so fresh. It wasn't reinventing the wheel, but it was finding new things to do with the wheel. It took the scraps and toys of Star Wars past and transformed them into 3-dimensional, compelling characters. But for Season 2, Mandalorian was no longer dealing with scraps. It was now dealing with franchise royalty. The Mandalorian is at its best when it reinvents the familiar, then Season 2's premiere, The Marshal, embodies nearly everything I love about this show. The episode begins with Mando venturing back to Tatooine in search of another Mandalorian, which we all know means the return of Boba Fett. The entire time during the build-up, I'm just waiting for him to appear, for the inevitable showdown between the old and the new. Finally, Mando comes face to face with Boba's iconic armor, and Boba is not the one wearing it. This was a wonderful subversion, as instead we're introduced to an entirely different character named Cobb Vanth, who was first introduced in Chuck Wendig's novel, Aftermath. This is the sort of deep lore cuts I adore, and I think speaks to the strengths of this show. It takes Boba's iconic armor, and gives it to a new owner to use in their own special way. Nearly every element of this episode is in some way repurposed. Cobb's speeder appears to be one of Anakin's pod race engines, the Sand People are given a mini redemption arc, and we finally get to see the full wrath of a crate dragon, whom we were first introduced to as a skeleton all the way back in A New Hope. The episode even shifts into the IMAX aspect ratio for this kaiju showdown, and the battle that progressed lived up to the quality of spectacle we sadly missed out on this year. While the fan service like the jetpack gag is nice, the real magic of this episode is the bond that forms between Din and Cobb Vanth. Even as they disagree over Vanth's use of the Mandalorian armor, Mando comes to respect him and the good he's done for this little corner of Tatooine. Finally, the episode ends with a tease of Boba Fett, out of his armor and transformed into a new character. I would have been satisfied if this was all we saw of him before his spin-off show, but alas, the show had other plans. I wanted to single out this episode because as the season progressed, it was the high bar that the following episodes would have to fight hard to hit. It was a clear upgrade from the first season in terms of scale and spectacle, but kept that heart we all fell in love with. This episode made clear that this show had refined its functional formula, telling self-contained stories within the Star Wars universe while continuing the narrative of Mando and the child. These stories don't take us to entirely new places, but I think that's this show's secret strength. That everything is recycled. The Krykna spiders from Chapter 10 come from unused concept art for Empire. The machine that pulls the Razor Crest out of the water in Chapter 11 appears to be a repurposed AT-AT walker, and in Chapter 12, we see the seeds for what look like Palpatine's return. While this story is first and foremost a story about Mando and the child, there is a secondary yet equally important story in the background of Star Wars as a whole. This show has embraced its job as franchise maintenance, and they've done a phenomenal job adding context for how this galaxy has evolved. It's not just that the story pulls from every era of Star Wars, but that it cleverly recontextualizes each element to fit this story. The end result is the most lived-in and realized galaxy that Star Wars has ever seen, and I think that alone is worthy of praise. However, as the season progressed, these details stopped staying in the background and began to take center stage. Star Wars is a series all about balance. Balance between the dark side and the light, between nature and technology, and now between fan service and originality. While the narrative goal of this season is to develop the story of the Mandalorian and the child, creatively the goal is to set up Star Wars' future storylines. Given the context of the announcements made during the Disney investors meeting, many of these episodes are blatant backdoor pilots for these fan-favorite spin-offs. Their inclusion in the story raises the question, are they purely here to bounce off into their own narratives, or do they provide any substance to Din Djarin's journey? The answer is both. You don't want your title characters getting dethroned in their own story, but if you're not going to incorporate the defining parts of Star Wars into this narrative, why even set it in a galaxy far, far away? The showrunners were constantly having to juggle these two priorities, and the results varied per episode. The first major supporting character to come from other Star Wars media is Bo-Katan, an alumni from the fan-favorite Clone Wars cartoon. Despite some goofs like her age not quite lining up, Bo-Katan and her Mandalorian allies make a great addition to this journey, precisely because of their identity. From the minute they're introduced, there's a tension created between these parties as Din and Bo have different perceptions on what constitutes being a Mandalorian.
He's one of them.
Think, Ferric.
One of what?
Learning that Din's obsessive devotion to wearing his helmet is only done by a specific creed is great, as it creates a personal obstacle for him to overcome in order to further his mission. Why I think this inclusion works is that it serves Mando's story first and is a nice nod to Clone Wars fans second. Every single character, whether a fan favorite or brand new, has to justify their inclusion in this story.
This is the way.
Once Bo has served her purpose, she gives Mando the next part of his mission, which leads us to Chapter 13, The Jedi, marks the biggest shift in the series thus far, as it's the first time the show changes perspectives. Each of these chapters tell stories about the characters Mando meets on his journey, but Chapter 13 is first and foremost Ahsoka's journey. Look at the way she's introduced versus all the other supporting characters. Whenever we are introduced to a key supporting role in this show, we meet them at the same time that Mando does. This helps cement that this is Din's story, as we are experiencing these characters from his point of view. Ahsoka, on the other hand, is introduced in her own action scene, used to highlight her skills and badassery. It is clear that the filmmakers are emphasizing that this is Ahsoka's debut into live action. Once the two characters cross paths, the perspective does change back to Mando, and I think this is a fantastic fight scene that should have been her grand entrance. It's honestly one of my favorite action beats in the entire show. Short but sweet, creative reversals, and it doesn't overstay its welcome as both characters turn their attention to Grogu.
I hope it's about him.
And yeah, that's one of the big revelations of this episode. Baby Yoda's got a name.
Grogu.
More than any of the action, atmosphere, or world building in this episode, seeing Grogu begin his Jedi training while Mando watches and participates is the real highlight. One of the joys of a television show is the ability to slow down, and in these scenes, I was reminded of the great character work we got in Empire. So much of this show is transactional, so once Ahsoka helps out Grogu on his journey, Mando helps Ahsoka save this village, and here's where the Ahsoka show really takes over. We get a big fight scene and a Thrawn name drop.
Where is Grand Admiral Thrawn?
All the while Mando awkwardly listens on the sidelines. Just as the characters are trading favors, they are also trading importance in screen time. But it works, because they did the character work in the center and proved Ahsoka's worth to this story. The show really had this balance down until... Chapter 14 is the most frustrating episode of this entire show. It's titled The Tragedy, and if we look at this season as a 6-hour movie, this is the clear end of Act 2 low point. As the story builds momentum of Din bringing Grogu to a Jedi, using the Force-sensitive Seeing Stone Ahsoka mentioned in the previous episode, in comes Moff Gideon's stormtroopers to take Grogu for their own nefarious means. The ritual portal thingy puts Grogu out of commission, leaving him vulnerable, which for Gideon is the perfect time to strike. This is really good story pacing. Right as the heroes are about to achieve their goal, you throw them a curveball and watch how they scramble. That's really what this episode needed to be about. Mando had taken Grogu through hell and back to bring him here, only to lose him to his former captors. So why is this the episode you bring back Boba Fett? The staging of this reintroduction is odd. It begins with the two of them having a standoff over Mando possessing Boba's iconic armor, and before that conflict can properly resolve, the stormtroopers just show up and we jump right into the action. Here the episode splits into two objectives. Mando focuses on protecting the child, and Boba focuses on reclaiming his armor. Instead of Mando giving back Boba's armor in a way that would be meaningful for both of them, Boba just takes it for himself. There is no story payoff for Mando here, as now the main focus is to see Boba kick ass. And it's fun. Robert Rodriguez knows how to shoot action, but I can't help but feel that this grand entrance conflicts with the episode's overall tone of, well, tragedy. Because of this, Grogu's capture feels like more of an inconvenience than a genuine moment of despair. I actually think you could make this episode far more effective if you just reordered it. Have Grogu get captured first, with Mando being overwhelmed, then have Boba come in to save the day, ending with the grand reveal. Make Boba the cherry on top of this dramatic set piece, like Legolas taking down the Mumakil in Return of the King. Moments like this work best after the main tension has resolved, but instead, the fan service was more important than the core story.
That still only counts as one!
This was the first time I really became worried about this show, where the concerns over the show's priorities came to the forefront. Luckily for The Mandalorian, they followed this episode up with the strongest chapter in the entire series. Throughout the entirety of Season 2, Mandalorian was staying strict to its established formula of hanging out with Mando and Grogu while setting up Star Wars' future. In comes Chapter 15, the penultimate episode of the season, that would throw this formula on its head. After back-to-back episodes setting up fan-favorite characters, here comes an episode all about Bill Burr. Side characters from the first season were already being brought back in creative ways, but here we get an entirely new look at Space Boston's most dangerous sharpshooter. On a plot level, they bring Mayfield back to break into an Imperial base and locate Moff Gideon, but on a story level, they bring him back to confront the Mandalorian on his upcoming decisions. This episode has the Mandalorian at his most desperate. Time is of the essence, and he's willing to do anything to get Grogu away from harm. This is where Mayfield comes in. Being the most cynical and confrontational voice on this show, he's a perfect companion to bring on this mission. With desperate times come desperate measures, and thus to complete this stealth mission, Mando has to give up his beskar armor in order to blend in as a regular stormtrooper. From an action standpoint, this is a fantastic setback. All season long, we've seen him rely on his jetpack and beskar to get out of countless sticky situations, but here he's stuck with armor that breaks on first contact. While being an action setback, this loss is also a major character setback. That mask was his face, and as part of his code, he was never to be seen without it. While Mando still keeps his face covered, Mayfield is the first to point out the blatant contradiction.
Is it that you can't take off your Mando helmet or you can't show your face? Because there is a difference.
Saving Grogu comes at the cost of his integrity as a Mandalorian. Mayfield does this, of course, because he has no integrity. He's a former Imperial, and no one will let him forget it.
You sure do know a lot about Imperial remnants.
Hey, if you want to accuse me of something, then just say it.
Whereas characters like Mando have duty and responsibility, Mayfield only does what he can to survive. In essence, he's a non-believer. The whole episode is built around conflicting priorities. Take a look at the central chase scene. It's Fury Road meets Sorcerer. Mando and Mayfield have to outrun pirates, but they can't drive too fast or else they risk blowing up the rhydonium they're carrying. It's obstacles on top of obstacles. With none of the fancy toys Mando's been accustomed to, he has to think creatively and quickly in order to complete their mission. It all builds to a moment of dramatic confusion when it's the Empire that saves the day. While they made it into the base, their actions have also indirectly helped with the Empire's continued oppression. As great as this action set piece is, the real dramatic fireworks come once they enter the base. The plan is for Mayfield to scan his face on the computer to get Moff Gideon's coordinates, but he recognizes his former superior in the room and doesn't want to risk getting caught.
I can't do it, okay? We have to abort. I'm sorry.
His own self-interest gets in the way of completing the mission. As we can see, everything Mayfield does in this episode is to push Mando on his core beliefs. He won't let Grogu get away, so without hesitation, he takes off his helmet to access the computer.
Facial scan complete.
If the episode ended here, it would be a rock-solid chapter. The circumstances and characters surrounding Mando forced him to let go of his core beliefs and grow as a character. But Mando is not the believer the title refers to. Mayfield's former superior takes notice of Din and starts asking questions that Mando doesn't have answers for.
What's your TK number?
His cover's about to be blown when Mayfield steps in and takes control of the situation. This tense encounter is so well done. Richard Brake does a phenomenal job playing up the creepiness of his character, and they never undercut it by Mayfield poking fun at seeing Din's face. He knows the severity of this action, but he has a part to play. The fear of being caught by a superior has dissolved, and even worse, the superior doesn't even recognize Mayfield. As their conversation continues, Mayfield brings up one of the key battles he served under.
How about a toast to Operation Cinder?
Mando is positioned between the two. silently listening, being our eyes and ears. When Mayfeld becomes more confrontational, you can see the fear in Din's eyes, begging him not to press further. But Mayfeld must. This is the man responsible for the deaths of all of his friends, the man who sent Mayfeld to his presumed death, and yet can't even bother to remember him. In Mayfeld's face, you can just see the pain of this incident, the trauma of being thrown away like cattle. Throughout his 2 episodes on this show, Mayfeld's been defensive of his history with the Empire, which the audience assumes is due to the shame of being on the evil and losing side of the war.
I wasn't a stormtrooper, wise ass.
But, as this episode digs deeper, we find that Mayfeld himself is a victim of the Empire's atrocities, that he has just as much cause as anyone to fear their return. And once he comes face to face with this fear, of this pure manifestation of evil, his mission, his survival instincts, they all disappear because he's finally found his line. The episode climaxes with their escape, and here we see Mayfeld's sharpshooting skills get put to good use, most notably in blowing up the Rhydonium that they initially transported into the base for the sake of their mission. The sins of their actions have been redeemed, and only when the core conflict of the episode is over do we get the wonderful fanservice nod of those amazing dubstep bombs from Attack of the Clones. I'm not gonna lie, this was one of the best 30 minutes of Star Wars media I've ever seen. They did more with the disaffected Imperial in 1 episode than the sequel trilogy did in 3 movies. All the while advancing the storylines of our core characters. It's a testament that this entire show is a refutation on the one-dimensional side character. That every person that crosses Mando's path has a meaningful story waiting to be told. Of course, there is still one side character we have yet to talk about. Alright, it's time to finally talk about this season's defining moment. While seasons of television are built of thousands of moving parts, multiple characters, dozens of scenes, when you break them down, they are only defined by a handful of moments. Look at the greatest television shows in history and you'll see what I mean. The Red Wedding, Face Off, Ronnie Lily, Modern Warfare. Don't stop! Most seasons of television live or die by these moments. For better or worse, this moment defines the entire 8-episode story arc, and I have mixed feelings on it. In retrospect, this moment seems obvious. Mando's mission from last season was to find a Jedi. And if you've seen the original trilogy, you know which direction this leads.
When gone am I, the last of the Jedi will you be?
This being the endpoint of the journey makes complete narrative sense. It's set up in Chapter 14, and given the multiple run-ins with the Rebellion, it was almost destined to happen. Instead, it's the how and why that has made this scene so contentious. The rest of the episode before this moment is great. The mission is built on uneasy alliances, and despite their intelligent plans and moments of success, the heroes still find themselves under the thumb of the scenery-chewing Moff Gideon. As the odds crumble with the impending Death Troopers they've spent the entire season building up, the stability within the group falters as Mando's actions fighting Moff Gideon have thwarted Bo-Katan's mission of rightfully claiming the Darksaber.
In order for her to wield the Darksaber again, she would need to defeat you in combat.
At this point, I was in the drama. I was wondering how the tension between the characters would resolve, and whether that tension would interfere with the mission of rescuing Grogu. Would there be a sacrifice? A betrayal? An action or revelation about these characters we spent all season building up? Instead, Luke Skywalker shows up and cuts through the Dark Troopers like butter. A lot has been said about the framing of this moment, especially how it echoes the now iconic Darth Vader hallway massacre at the end of Rogue One. I still like this moment. I think the horror-like tone fits the narrative, and it uses this terror to highlight the individual sacrifices made by these brave rebel soldiers.
Here! Take it!
But that's not why the scene is remembered. It's remembered because we get to see Darth Vader kick ass. This is often why villains become such fan-favorite characters. The best-selling Star Wars action figures are always the villains. The fun of villains is that you get to make them as intimidating and powerful as possible. The more imposing they are, the more fearful we become when our heroes go up against them. And the more satisfying it is when they're finally defeated. All of this is to say, the way action frames our heroes is vastly different to how it frames the villains. With heroes, you want to do the opposite. You want to stack the odds, show them at their most vulnerable and compromised. Once you do this, the heroes are forced to make dramatic choices, which is the entire point of these scenes.
I'll never turn to the dark side.
The Mandalorian knows this. I know it knows this because they've been doing it flawlessly for 16 chapters. Mando is certainly cool, but he's not perfect. He's never an unstoppable badass, and that's exactly why this show works. Even stories about extreme power fantasies know this. John Wick, the series about the f***ing boogeyman, still follows these principles. So when we look at this moment with Luke Skywalker, he's not presented as a hero. He's not presented as a protagonist or even as a character. Instead, he's presented as an action figure. It's all about the silhouette, the poses. Each beat is there to show off a cool new move. Not once is there a complication. Not once does Luke Skywalker have to make a choice. He just effortlessly storms through as we're meant to cheer. In a word, it's indulgent. While I understand why people like this scene, to me this is a line I really don't like crossing. It's a sort of dopamine hit that works in the moment, but is never truly satisfying. And honestly, as a Luke fan, I don't see Luke Skywalker in this action. Luke is so much more creative, full of personality. There's no trying to persuade or bargain, it's just the fulfillment of the fan power fantasy. The exact same fulfillment that The Last Jedi was smart to avoid. In that film, power and badassery came at a cost. But even outside the characterization of Luke, the mere inclusion of him, CG face and all, completely sucks the wind out of this story. The audience is still riding high from the thrill of seeing Luke, and yet we now have to shift focus to Mando and Grogu saying goodbye. Everything between the two is working so well. Mando finally takes off his mask for Grogu, he's finally emotionally opening up. This is like the ending of E.T. I should be crying. And instead, I'm thinking about how CG face technology still has a few years to go. This scene is the climax to Season 2's two conflicting narratives. It's a climax to the story, the send-off for the partnership we followed from the beginning. And it's a climax to the fan service, the high of bringing Luke Skywalker the legend back to life. It tries to have both, but fan service is an all-consuming thing. Fan service always wins. In the scene where the Mandalorian fulfills its mission statement of turning an action figure into a character, it inadvertently turns the series' most beloved character back into an action figure. And despite the rock-solid season of television Lucasfilm gave us, I can't help but feel uncertain about their future. Hey everyone, it's been a minute. I just want to update you on what's going on here at Films and Stuff. I have a couple of really big projects dropping soon. One's a project I started last summer, but is going to be finished for next week. I'm really excited for y'all to see it, and if you want to see it when it goes live, make sure to press the notification bell below. I'm also planning on covering the Marvel Disney Plus shows on this channel. Don't know exactly how I'm going to do it, but I'm really excited to dive in. Lastly, thanks for watching. Make sure to stay safe, and may the Force be with you.
Misa back.